Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Krisner. You can join Brian Curtis and myself for the stories making news and moving markets in the APAC region. You can subscribe to the show anywhere you get your podcast and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.
Nvidia has unveiled new chips aimed at extending the company's dominance in artificial intelligence computing. Nvidia says its new processor design, named Blackwell, is multiple times faster at handling the computer models behind AI. That includes the process of developing AI technology known as training and running the process AI. Nvidia says its Blackwell chips will be the basis of new computers and other products being deployed by the world's largest data center operators. That roster includes Amazon, Microsoft, Alphabet, and Oracle. Jensen Huang, Nvidia's CEO and co-founder, said AI is the driving force in a fundamental change in the economy.
The industry is being transformed, not just ours. Because the computer industry, the computer is the single most important instrument of society today, fundamental transformations in computing affects every industry.
Jensen Huang there, NVIDIA CEO and co-founder. NVIDIA shares were down about 1.7% in late trading. Joining us now for some discussion on this is Nick Turner, Bloomberg Senior Editor for the technology team. Nick, thank you for joining us. So Jensen Huang, we heard him saying that the Blackwell processor is multiple times faster than previous chips. That sounds impressive, of course. But with a company like Nvidia, there's all kinds of superlatives, and we see that the stock price in after hours was a little bit underwhelming. How was the response in the room?
Well, this is their first in-person event for this GTC conference in 4 years, essentially, since the pandemic started. And, I wasn't there myself, but just seeing the photos my colleagues sent and just the vibe of people who were there, it just really seemed like kind of a really pumped up crowd. This company is now one of the biggest stars in the tech world, up there with Apple and Microsoft, and in some ways more exciting to people just because of what it's doing in terms of changing the way computing works.
And the company seems so far ahead of the competition when it comes to this. And I think it goes back to its roots in developing the graphics processors that were used for the gaming industry, where you had to kind of create a chip that was able to handle complex calculations so quickly, but dynamically as well, because you had inputs coming from two sides, from the game itself and then from the gamer who was interacting with the control surface. I'm wondering, though, when it comes to this idea of encryption, we played a cut earlier where Mr. Huang was talking about encryption. How do we understand what NVIDIA is doing as it moves toward AI to develop a secure environment?
Well, I think, first of all, this is a company really that has its hands in so many areas in terms of just designing software, services, the simulations. Obviously, the chips are kind of its biggest source of revenue, but I think that it really wants to sort of create an ecosystem around what it's selling, and obviously that includes security and encryption. And I think that in broader terms, a lot of these areas that it's been in, it's sort of had to make sure people feel like they're safe and they're, secure. And I think that that's part of the pitch.
It is interesting. I think we're learning here as time goes on that there's not just one winner in this AI space. There'll be multiple winners. So in addition to NVIDIA, a lot of the people in that room probably, working, we said Amazon, Microsoft, Alphabet, and Oracle are, in a sense, even competitors with NVIDIA. And then you have AMD and Broadcom and a whole slew of others. In your estimation here, is this rolling out in that way where a lot of people win? And that's not even to mention all the downstream recipients of the AI technology. Are we going to see a lot of winners here?
Well, demand is so much higher than supply at the moment that I think in the short-term release, it does seem like you're going to have a lot of winners. I think AMD is going to be successful with its, the same sort of style as chip that Nvidia sells that's coming out this year. It's already increased its forecast for how much that's going to generate. Intel has its own version too, which is maybe not being received quite as warmly, but then, as you mentioned, the cloud companies themselves, they're designing some of their own chips that are going to handle these functions. So ultimately, they become customers, but also competitors. But part of the reason for that is they really want to sort of have control over the process and maybe make it a little bit easier to ensure that they get as much of whatever chip it is that they need.
Are we reaching an inflection point in the near future where this investment in the technology is going to have to be justified? There's going to have to be a return on investment seen. So the use case, I mean, I understand the technology and the amazing things that it's capable of doing, but for a company to actually derive a benefit from that as it's invested in this technology, are we a ways away from seeing that?
Well, it's funny to hear him speak today. He kept coming back to this theme of sort of the AI factory, that these data centers are sort of AI factories. And I think he sort of said, he talked about how they were money makers and profitable. And I don't know if that's the case right now for these companies, but I think that it did seem like he was hitting the theme that these things were going to be a profitable enterprise, at least in the near term. But I think you're right. If suddenly tomorrow AI services were held to, sort of a make or break, you have to be profitable or we're sort of cutting you off, then that wouldn't be I don't think many are ready at that point. Even the big companies that are investing in this. So it's the big debate, I think, is this closer to the .com bubble of 2000, or is it farther back, like 1995 or something like that? I mean, you hear that a lot, and I'm not sure anyone knows.
There's that in the stock price, and the reason I asked you about are there multiple winners is so that people don't necessarily feel so beholden by Nvidia, that there are other places to turn. So I wanted to ask you about this processor. I mean, he said multiple times faster. So, and that's difficult to actually, deal with quantitatively. How does that compare with the last chip that they rolled out? How much did they say it was faster than previous iterations? So in order to get a feel for, how far is Nvidia ahead?
Yeah, I mean, not to get into sort of the too nitty gritty of the numbers, but I mean, you looked at some of these charts he threw up, and it's really a dramatic gain from even the current chip that obviously is so far ahead of the competition already that it's, in this incredible demand. So I think that it is going to be, both, I think, more powerful, but also hopefully more power efficient, which has been another issue that the AI industry in general and Nvidia has hit up against. Is just that these things, the electricity required of these things, the fact that data centers are outstripping the amount of energy available in their communities in some cases. I mean, he's got to hit a lot of points to sort of make sure people are not growing concerned about some of these issues.
So when NVIDIA is talking about the application for AI, the focus seems to be the cloud. And I want to see if we can kind of shoehorn in the Apple story today, because it seems like what Apple is trying to do is to give a lot more of that computing power to the phone, where the user is actually interfacing with the phone and maybe not so reliant on what's happening in the cloud. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. I mean, I think Apple in general, handling things on the device, it's better for security, privacy. That's a huge issue in terms of their marketing, Apple. And I think that the problem they're finding themselves in is that they're just a little bit too far behind on some of the cloud-based services that people have gotten excited about, ChatGPT and that ilk, obviously Gemini, which is the one they're in talks with from Google to potentially use in the iPhone. So I think they find that they've been concentrating on this on-device stuff for good reason, perhaps, but they're not quite caught up on the cloud-based AI services.
All right, Nick, thanks very much for joining us. Very interesting material there. Nick Turner, Bloomberg Senior Editor for the tech team. So let's see, we've got Amazon, Anthropic, we've got Microsoft OpenAI, and now Alphabet, Apple, at least those three big camps, and Nvidia and AMD seemingly in their two camps on the chip side. It's setting up as a fascinating story. Chinese regulators say the developer Evergrande falsely inflated revenue by more than $78 billion in the 2 years leading to its failure. Joining us now is Kari Soo Lindberg, Bloomberg Private Credit and Loans reporter. So we won't have any trading in Evergrande. The stock's been suspended since it went into liquidation. I guess it's a good time today to talk a little bit about the overarching story about Evergrande. In terms of these fines, a hefty fine for the founder and the former CEO, as well as for the Hengda unit in China, right?
That's right. So, thanks, Brian. So, essentially, Hui, who was the founder and chairman of Evergrande, was fined 47 million yuan, as well as Hengda was fined 4.18 billion yuan, which is quite sizable fines. And so really what this means is, in some ways, this is the latest blow for Hui, who was once among Asia's richest tycoons and saw the sprawling empire. So, it really strikes at the heart of Evergrande, especially when they were once one of the leading growth engine of the world's second largest economy. And this is really just, more details and flaming the fires in that sense.
I'm wondering whether it's unique to Evergrande, which is not to say that other companies were, engaged in similar practices, and maybe not as extreme as this, where you inflate revenue by more than $78 billion over 2 years. But are there questions being asked more broadly about the accounting standards that some of these property developers have used in the past, or ways that they are accounting for property sales?
Yeah, that's a good point. And just to put a little bit into perspective, the numbers you brought. So for 2019, Hengda inflated their total revenue by 63%. And for 2020, they inflated their numbers by 87%, which is massive. Well, I don't think this is in some ways unique to Evergrande. I think what it really shows you is why the government was trying to overhaul the whole regulatory system quite strongly and tighten the lending. So if we'll remember, and just going back a little bit onto the 3+ year saga of this company, it was really, it was expanding tremendously by taking on massive amounts of debt. But once the regulators started tightening their ability to borrow money, that's when the trouble really started. And so I think that's really what we're seeing, right? We're seeing, once you tighten those practices, if you're not 100% sound in some ways, that this is what could await you. And I think that's really a signal to other companies.
Yeah, and Hui himself is still under police control, as far as we know, and is subject to whatever mandatory measures means. But is there much progress in terms of selling assets of Evergrande to pay off the creditors, because that's an ongoing story that I think investors would be quite interested in.
You're right. It is an ongoing story because just in January, right, they were. The group received a liquidation order, and so I think that's still the ongoing story. I've no news on that front, but I could say that the mansion, a Hong Kong mansion that's tied to Hui, who was the founder of Evergrande, has been put up for sale. It's a luxury block that, and the tender ends on April 22nd. So, that's also a good barometer. Who wants to buy that, and where does the proceeds for that, his personal asset, go? I think that could provide a bellwether for where everything else goes as well.
Well, that was the question that I was going to ask next about the government's ability to claw back any of this this overstatement. Are there means for the government to be able to try to do that, to seize assets, to make up for this?
There are, but I think a large part of the issue is that not all of Evergrande's buildings and real estate infrastructure that they were responsible for were completed. So, you could seize an asset, but what's the point of seizing an asset that's not completed, right? So I think that's also the really tricky issue that's not facing not just Evergrande, I'd say, but the slew of Chinese real estate companies that are under severe distress or have already defaulted.
So, Kari Soo, one of the stories we did was that, we did see investment pick up and industrial production pick up. And we just mentioned a few moments ago that it has led some analysts and investors to think that maybe we'll get a little bit less stimulus. It brings us to the property sector. That's the biggest overhang. What are we seeing in terms of sales now, transactions and prices? Is it getting better or is it still getting worse?
I think it's not great, to be honest. And that's really the key barometer, what a lot of people are looking out for. We'll await that news as well and see what that happens.
So what recourse do you think will the government take here? I mean, if we're talking about the property market really being, or the weakness of the property market being the nerve center for this lack of positive sentiment, this lack of confidence in China, is there anything the government can do to kind of fortify the weakness that we have seen among these property developers, or have they just, or are they allowing the markets to kind of have their way right now?
I think that's a tough question, and I think that's one that we continue to watch because last year the government did put in kind of inject small amounts of liquidity into the market, right? And this was seen as marginally helping the property sector kind of shore up the very worst of it. But on the other hand, the debt and kind of the magnitude is so great that actually it's not enough. And the real question is, to what extent will the government continue to help the property sector? And that's kind of the question that's kind of been hanging over everyone for the past 3 years. All
right, Kari, thanks very much for joining us. Kari Soo Lindberg there, private credit and loans reporter for Bloomberg. We should mention that these fines, huge fines that were leveled against Hui Kaian, are civil in nature. No criminal charges have been filed against him. But as we mentioned, he's being held under police control. And it seems to suggest that there will be illegal crimes coming because when he was put under this control, it was mandatory measures due to, quote, suspicion of illegal crimes. Something to watch out for.
This has been the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast, bringing you the stories making news and moving markets in the Asia Pacific. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to get more episodes of this and other shows from Bloomberg. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.